Welcome to Mindful Management, Creating a Trauma-Informed Work Environment, a podcast by Chefalo Consulting, where we share the knowledge, stories, and resources you need to create a trauma-informed culture that supports wellness, growth, and resilience. I'm your host, Shenandoah Chefalo. Welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you're tuning in and that you are sharing your feedback and enjoying the episodes that we're putting together for you. On today's episode, this is actually one that I have been waiting to have a conversation. I can't wait to see where our guest brings us today. So on today's episode of Mindful Management, Creating a Trauma-Informed Work Environment, I am delighted to welcome Jennifer Moss, a seasoned producer and educator, currently serving as the Chief Creative Officer at JAR Audio and a lecturer at the University of British Columbia School of Creative Writing. She has a rich background in digital and audio storytelling and collaborates with a diverse range of creators to bring compelling stories to life across various media platforms. Known for her innovative approach to trauma-informed interview techniques, Jennifer's work prioritizes empathy and understanding, making her a respected figure in narrative creation and media education. And it is because of that that I am delighted to welcome Jennifer to our tiny little show in this corner of the world today. Jennifer, thanks for being with us.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm really pleased to have been invited. I think this is such an important topic.
I have been excited to have this conversation with you. And I was saying this to you before, we went live, which is so many people want to learn how to tell their stories, right? Stories hold such a significant place in our society. And I'm just wondering if you would share with us maybe a moment or how you began to recognize the power of not just stories, but trauma-informed techniques and storytelling, and how that's shaped your current approach to interviews and content creation.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's an interesting question. So I guess I started out in my professional career telling community-based stories. So looking around my neighborhood and finding things that seemed to matter to people where I lived, be that, the 50th anniversary of a Little League ball team, or, I did do one story that actually won an award here in Vancouver. It won a Jack Webster Award. And it was a radio program that was, I did it in the lead up to the Olympics in Vancouver, Canada, which were in 2010, unforgettable year here. But as often happens in the lead up to the Olympics, a lot of kind of cleaning up of so-called undesirable elements in the city took place. So I came across a story in a community paper called Megaphone at the time, which was one of those papers that people who are living on the street can earn money by selling. They can sort of stand on the corner and sell, and it tells stories that are relevant to them. So it's a wonderful initiative. And in that paper, I read a story about a mural artist who had done a mural on a wall in Vancouver's downtown east side, which is a very vibrant community, but it is also known as Canada's poorest postal code. And he had done this mural and he had run out of money for paint. So the sex workers in the neighborhood had brought him their old makeup to finish the mural. And I was so blown away by that. I thought that was such an incredible story that I wanted to take that story to a wider audience, but there was a lot of trauma in that community. The mural that the guy was creating was actually an ode to a woman who was a resident of the downtown east side who had been killed. And so, when I thought, how am I going to do this in a way that doesn't just sort of isn't extractive, doesn't just go into that community and rob these folks of their stories and then hightail it out. So that was a learning point for me. So what I did was I reached out to a local community center. I was introduced to a local neighborhood journalist who knew everybody on the streets around that area and who was able to come with me and the mural artist as we walked through town, talking to people, looking at things in the neighborhood and kind of highlighting the story. Because what had happened in the lead up to the Olympics is they had whitewashed that mural. They had wiped it out. It was gone. And so I wanted to tell the story of this sort of wild, unsanctioned art and the importance of that kind of art for the people making it. And so the piece was called Wild Art. And I definitely had to take a careful, trauma-informed approach to that project. And I think that was maybe the beginning of my awareness and my mental journey in terms of trauma-informed interviewing, and which has led to hopefully some trauma-informed management, although God knows I get it wrong at least half the time.
Now, Jennifer, now you're getting into our own vulnerability, which is we're all getting it wrong most of the time, right? So I love this. I'm putting it on my list to go search out this article, Wild Art, by the way. It speaks to my heart, Jennifer, in so many ways.
It was an audio piece, and I'll send you the link. Yeah.
And I'd love for us to be able to share it with our listeners as well, because it speaks to me in so many ways. One is, right, myself, I was part of the unhoused community. And so that always will have a strong component for me whenever there's a story highlighting that. And of course, I'm very familiar with those newspapers. But my daughter is an artist, right? And she is specifically compelled by street art and kind of its transient nature, to your point, that it's not sanctioned necessarily street art, real street art, right? Which is partially what makes it great, and also makes it transient, because at any moment it will be covered, whether it's by the Olympics or some other, a developer, right? Like it is vulnerable as the people who often produce it, right? And so that piece is so critical. So I'm just wondering, like, I can't help but think, like, kind of the first time you're doing this, maybe the first time this idea of the trauma-informed storytelling is entering, what did you get right? What did you get wrong? And we sort of hinted at this at the first, where you're like, hey, I might be doing more. I'm not sure. But I think that's such a critical component of this conversation, is that first awareness, but then what can we learn from the things we did well? And where is there still work to do on that piece of being, quote, trauma informed? And we'll dive into that part of what that means in your interview techniques in a second.
That's a great question. And I think for me, looking back on that project, because I was on a steep learning curve at the time, I was a new journalist. And you'll hear, if you listen to the piece, the sound quality is not the best and stuff, because I was still figuring it all out. But I think I did an excellent job in terms of the process of getting to know the artist, getting to know the community, going with folks from the community on their own terms, sharing the story for their reasons, the reasons that were important to them. Where I think I fell down, in retrospect, was the follow through, the sort of like I certainly shared the story with the community, like with the artist and with the community center through which I set the whole thing up. But beyond that, I kind of lost track of that artist. I'm not sure where he is now. And I have actually tried to look and find him and see how he's doing, and see if I could do a follow-up piece with him or something like that. I haven't been able to find him, which doesn't necessarily mean, like, he might just be out there living his best life. I don't know. But he was someone who had struggled with addiction. And so I worry that just that my follow through on, as I moved on as a journalist, that I didn't look back enough. It's hard to stop and look back, right? Like, journalists are all about, like, what is the next story that needs to be documented? But sometimes I think that looking back piece gets ignored.
I think that's so powerful. So I love this, that the thing you did well is the process of connecting. Because I say this in my work all the time about trauma informed. It's like connection, connection, connection. Like, connections and relationships are the background of without that, nothing else exists. And so I'm wondering if you might share with us, Jennifer, like, what trauma informed interview techniques involve for you, and what do you think's critical, especially in today's storytelling landscape?
Yeah. So I've had a lot of conversations with different journalists about this as we're all grappling with it. One journalist in particular, called Laura Palmer, comes to mind. She does a podcast called Island Crime. and it looks at a different true crime story every season. Now, Laura comes from a very trauma-informed perspective. And so what you'll notice in her work is that things like rather than featuring the murderer at great length, it tends to talk more from the perspective of the victims' families. It centers the victims. So that's one way that I think, like in the wildly popular true crime podcasting landscape,
And listen, I'm a true crime junkie, so I already love what you're talking about, right?
they're pretty interesting, but you know the difference, right, between the ones that actually spend the time to talk about the impact of the crime and then the ones that are just all sort of salacious and talking, like trying to recreate the murder through audio or whatever, you know. So I think there's a difference there, but I think it's all other things like just being aware that there could be different disabilities or different abilities that your interviewees are going to bring to the picture. So, for example, if someone is neurodivergent, perhaps they're going to prefer an audio-only interview. They might not like a lot of bright lights. I think things like being patient, having sort of sensitivity around the degree of difficulty someone might have in coming forward to speak about a story, especially if it touches on loss or abuse. I mean, that's a big ask of somebody. You're asking them to open their heart and be vulnerable, and they're going to, you know, they may have trouble doing that. It might need to happen on their timeline, not yours, you know. So thinking about more flexible timelines, thinking about forewarning people as much as possible about the type of area you're going to want to get into and explaining your reasons for doing so. So explaining your rationale, and then making sure that you stick to that. So you're not baiting and switching somebody. You're not kind of presenting the interview in one context and then later editing it into a different context so that they look foolish or misinformed or, you know, something like that. So just making sure that you're really authentic and you follow through with what you promised to do. And I think, you know, and being prepared to pause, being prepared to take breaks. Like I just brought up being unhoused. I'm sure that hits deep for you, right? Like doing so, like if you need to, this is one of those situations that where if you need to like roll your shoulders, I would understand, right? Like this is the thing, and people get so stressed when you put a microphone in front of them and a camera. So it's like, can you find a way to mitigate that? Maybe having some culturally appropriate sort of decompression processes in place. So like, for example, if you're interviewing an Indigenous person and you know you're going to be talking about in Canada, residential schools is a big topic right now. If that is part of the intention of the interview and you know you're going to be going there, have you thought about that person's emotional safety so that when the interview is over, they don't feel like an open wound? Like, is there somebody who can, in a culturally specific way, offer them some kind of cleansing or just an ear, an understanding ear, and can you set that up? So I think there are many ways to go about it, and it mostly just involves communication, listening, and just a little bit of empathy, trying to put yourself in that person's shoes.
So Jennifer, I appreciate all these. And listen, I'm taking notes so everybody knows. So sometimes I'm not looking directly at Jennifer. It's because I'm writing, because there's so many really powerful things I think you said in just that small block. And if I could summarize it, what I heard was, how do you cultivate empathy? And I think that is such a background to trauma-informed work, whether you're trying to get to a story, like in your case for a journalistic purpose, or you're just trying to communicate with your staff or your mother-in-law or people in which you worship with, right? Like in all of the spaces in which you exist, there's so many things there about authenticity, about the slowing down and pausing and actually taking in. In the big ask, I love that you use that framework about the big ask, because one of the things that people ask me is, because listen, a lot of the work that I do is based on first person, my story of my life before foster care, during foster care, and post foster care, right? And people say, Shen, how do I tell my story of that way? And I said to you before this interview, one of the reasons I'm so glad to have you on is, even for our listeners who are thinking about wanting to tell their story, I think what you're saying has a lot of power as well. Not just for the person asking these questions, but the person who's wanting to share. Because I think for me, you're right. It is a big ask. How do I get myself in that place to even be able to take this step to talk about it? How are you authentic? I say this all the time without always being graphic, because I think we live in a society who loves the graphic nature of a story, but you can say a lot of things without saying the thing, very often, right? Like, but still feeling like, am I being true to myself? And so I'm wondering how, when you're even working with folks and telling those stories, like, how do you help them meter some of those in between spaces for yourself, for them, for your listeners and readers, in all of the ways, Jennifer?
I think I try to ask questions. First of all, I recognize this simple fact that if someone is raw, a question can be perceived as a form of aggression. So I recognize that, first of all, and I'll often say that. The second thing I might do would be to really try to get curious about what's in it for that person to share their story. What is making them even consider sharing their story? Because it's really nobody's business but their own. So what could be some of the reasons that they may be considering it, and give them the opportunity to articulate that for themselves. Um, you know, journalists, I mean, the pat answer is, when you share your story, other people might hear it and feel something and be moved by it and feel encouraged. So you are putting light into the world where there was darkness. And I think sometimes that's enough for people. Sometimes they need more than that. Sometimes it's about, like, are you being actually paid for your time if you're offering, I don't know, cultural insights, for example, and you're sick of being asked. So sometimes it's that, so it just depends, like, what's in it for them has to be part of the conversation. And then I try to serve that goal. So whether that's they would like to, hear the rough cut of the piece and have some agency in it, whether it's they would like to be paid, or it might be enough for them just to understand, like, who is this going out to, and who could you potentially reach by doing this? Like, what audience is this aimed at? So contextualizing the piece that you're making so that the person understands their part that they're playing within it. Yeah, so those are all things that I would look at. And I think just encouraging people, like someone like yourself, if you're being asked to tell your story again, I think you have every right to say, I don't feel like it. It's Tuesday, right? I'll do it maybe for you next week after I send my daughter off to school or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like, you have the right to tell your story at a time and place and in a way that feels right to you. And you have the right to put some parameters around that.
I so appreciate that, Jennifer. And so one thing I want to stop before I hearken down that road just for a moment is the piece that you said about get curious, because that's the background of my work. We talk about using trauma-informed question and asking curious questions. But before you said that, you said something that I think is really, really critical for our listeners to hear, which is a question can be perceived as aggression, depending on the state that the person's in. And I think that is such a critical thing for us just to pause on for a second, because I think, right, here's the balance again, that it's not all or nothing or either or, it's yes and, right? And finding the balance of when is your curiosity really curiosity, and when, to your point of something you said earlier, is it time to pause because someone might be raw, might be in a moment that it can be taken as that super feels aggressive to me. And I just think, Jennifer, I'll just share real quick, is for a long time, I never shared my story. And it was actually my plan to never, ever, ever share my story. I had made a solemn promise at 18 that I would never talk about it. But something actually really intriguing happened with a journalist in my life. And they were doing a story on me not about my experience. They didn't know about that. It was actually something tied in with my professional life at the time. And the journalist said, Shenandoah, that's such a unique name. Can you tell me about how you got that name? Like, and it was really like one of the first questions he asked me. And so I told him a story, which had been a story told to me about how I got my name. And I had never thought about that story. It was a story I repeated, I don't know, 200 times in my life, probably. And after our interview concluded, he emailed me and said, I have some follow up questions. And one of them is about the story you told me regarding your name, because I did some research on your story. And so the story I told him was, oh, my parents met at the Shenandoah Hotel in Las Vegas. And aren't we glad it wasn't the Tropicana? And it was kind of this silly little piece that I had told him 1,000 times. For those of us who even remember that the Tropicana was a hotel, right? Like, at least they didn't meet at the Tropicana, because that would have been a way worse name. And I always would kind of tell this joke about it. And I never thought two thoughts about the story, Jennifer, to be perfectly honest with you. But he then emailed me back and said, I did some research, and it turns out that the Shenandoah Hotel was built after you were born, which was, I never fact checked my own story, right? Like,
Intriguing.
because it was a story that had just been told to me. And so I had been, and what happened for me in that moment was this shame of like, oh my God, I've been lying my whole life, unintentionally, but lying nonetheless. And two, to get myself out of the shame of the lie, I'm going to have to tell you this even more shameful thing. Was like, if you understand my mom, then you'll understand why I would have accepted the story and quote lied, right, Jennifer? So but I remember getting the email and thinking, this feels like the most aggressive email I've ever, which by the way, it was not aggressive in any tone or tenor, but to your point,
It hit a nerve.
right? And like, it was a moment that I'm so grateful for, where I was like, I've got to shut down my whole computer and go away, which I'm not always great at, by the way, that pause for myself. And that's why I wanted to bring it up, is like, for whatever reason, somebody was like, try to run away from this, which I think was the best advice at the time. And so that piece of like the aggression is like, by the way, when I reread that email today, it is not aggressive in any tone. And that's what I want our listeners to hear, is like you may not be aggressive in any of the ways in which anybody interprets aggressiveness. And yet when you're that raw in that moment, how it is perceived and taken in to protect yourself can be.
Yeah. I mean, basically, you can never really understand what's going on in another person's heart and mind, right? You can think that you're trying to be empathetic, but you're never quite going to get it. That line about questions being perceived as a form of aggression sometimes was shared with me by a songwriter who I admire called Farron Foisey. She's Canadian, really, really incredible songwriter, Farron. And she's a deep thinker, and her life she's been through a lot too, Shenandoah. So she's speaking from a trauma-informed place, let's just say. And she definitely, she's the person that kind of opened my eyes to that point. And so I'm a pretty direct person, so I'm probably going to step on some toes, and so I think it's sometimes for the person doing the interviewing, it's a matter of just knowing that. And it's really hard now in our remote culture, especially, to pick up on all the vibes and signals that you would get, the way people are breathing, everything. We think we're getting full information through this format that you and I are talking on right now. We would be much closer, and this would be I'd probably be crying now if this was happening.
I'd probably never leave, because I'd be like, Jennifer, tell me all the things you know, and you would never be able to get off the phone.
We'd have tea, it would just be different. Yeah.
It's the whole Canadian versus American approach too, which I just love, because you're like, let's have tea. And I'm like, absolutely, let's have tea. So Jennifer, you said one other thing there, which is picking the time and place to tell this story, or the confines of which it's around. And the other reason that resonated with me so much is that I was just at an event in a different state here in the United States. And somebody, like, the event, like, like someone was sponsoring my talk, right? And the sponsor was introducing me, and I kind of knew who the sponsor was. They didn't know me, but I knew them and their organization, and I thought this might not go well because I knew what I was going to say. And for our listeners, like I'm 17 years now into telling my story, right? So I've developed some things around doing that. And at this stage of telling my story, I'm going to tell it regardless of who's in the room because I've come to a place where I almost just don't care anymore if it and I'm comfortable with it. And I know it's going to ruffle some feathers and it's going to make some people uncomfortable because it doesn't always align with rainbows and unicorns
Shocking.
and happily ever afters that we sometimes want to celebrate. And there's a place for all of that, but I'm just not there any longer to be like, to say the thing you want to hear. I'm going to say the thing I want to say. And so it's my truth, right? And so I thought, and this isn't a particularly conservative area. And I thought, well, here we go, right? Like the worst you're going to do is never hire me again. And I'm okay with that. And I've kind of come to that place for myself. And so what was really interesting is as I was looking at this audience, about 1,500 people, I could see lots of people nodding their head as I was talking. And I was like, oh, maybe it's not going to be as bad as I thought. And then I sat down and the person who came up after me said, oh, we sometimes need a story that will step on our toes. And then I realized, oh, I really did step on toes. So I'm wondering, Jennifer, from a journalistic standpoint, from helping people tell their stories, what techniques are you using to navigate emotional responses, both from the person you're interviewing and the things happening around, to not cause further distress? So this did not cause further distress for me because I'm in a different place, but I could imagine had they said that to any thousands of numerous other people, that it could have really sent somebody spiraling.
Yeah, for sure. Stepping on toes, that's an interesting one because I consider that a sacred duty. So I might be the wrong person to ask. Yeah, I kind of think that if you're stepping on toes, if you're making a small ruckus in a polite way, but you're making a bit of a ruckus, I think all you're doing is you're awakening people to an aspect of reality that they may not have been aware of before. And I genuinely think you're doing a service at that point. Like, I genuinely think the world needs more of that. We need less siloed thinking. We need more nuanced thinking. We need to better understand each other as people, right? And so in the situation you described where you're presenting a story that might have made some people uncomfortable because of your views on the unhoused, let's say, you're speaking from personal experience. They can feel how they want to feel as a result of you speaking about it. But that is sort of separate from, like, when you speak your truth, you speak your truth. I think there's situations where speaking your truth can be unsafe. And as a journalist, I respect those situations. So I've had to interview people where we change their name, for example, or we only use their first name, or we change their voice because their truth ruffles so many feathers in the area where they live or work that their actual safety is threatened. And if that's the case, then I think it is the journalist's obligation to protect that person's safety, right? And so sometimes, and here's where it gets tricky, sometimes the person themselves, in their desire to tell their story, may not be fully aware of the ramifications. I'm thinking about things like when young people talk about shoplifting that they have done, and then later want to get a job at a bank. As a journalist, if I use the full name of that young person in the piece, like there's guidelines around that for a good reason, right? Because those people have the right as minors to be protected when they then go on and grow up and stop shoplifting and decide to go work at a bank and shoplift at a whole other level.
Yes.
So, like I...
now you're getting us into a different conversation,
sorry.
Jennifer.
Oops. Oops, did I ruffle some feathers?
It's a conversation I'd love to have with you, actually.
Wow. You raise a really good point that people can be at different points in their journey when they're sharing their story. And so that's why I think just having the journalist person, the storyteller, needs to have some responsibility for contextualizing the interview for that person and helping them understand not just what's being said in the interview, but the context that it's going into. Yeah, like you might have appreciated some warning, for example, at that talk about like, this is a super conservative audience, and just so you know, blah, 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 right?
It would have been a little bit helpful because I could have maneuvered some things, right? We could have the context piece, right? So I'm wondering then, how do you balance the need to tell compelling, impactful stories? Because I sort of think about this piece I saw with Chimamanda Adichie a long time ago about the danger of a single story. And in that, and I'm going to paraphrase, and I'll probably paraphrase really badly. She says, stories have the power to misalign us and to disempower us, but stories also have the power to bring us together. And it's whose stories, how many stories that we tell. And so I'm wondering, how do you balance the need to tell compelling, impactful stories with the responsibility as well to not sensationalize or exploit the traumatic experience? And to your point, we sort of touched on this with the true crime, but I think that this can happen in many ways, right? Is the story about the unhoused, or is the story about the art, or is the story about something in between all of those pieces, right? So how do you balance, and I think this is helpful not just from a journalistic standpoint for our listeners, but many of our listeners work with vulnerable populations. And those stories are critical in helping them to get funding to continue the work that they do. Those stories are right, like in all the ways. And I think this is something that more and more people are coming around, is how do we tell the impactful story without exploiting? And how do we find that balance?
Yeah, it's important to ask that question. So I think for me, there's some really great work being done that centers the positive aspects of a vulnerable person or population or neighborhood, as well as the more problematic or challenging or oppressed aspects of that person or neighborhood or group of people. So making sure that you're celebrating as well as exposing, fault lines. I think both are equally important. And in fact, you also have a duty of care to the audience or the reader, whoever is consuming the media product that you're making. Maybe you want to ruffle some feathers, maybe you want to draw their attention to something, but you also have to consider their emotional safety. You don't know who's on the receiving end of your work. And so I think making work that is just sort of like some form of therapy for the person is not enough. You actually have to frame that in a context and give people actionable things that they can do to get involved at the end. Maybe offer some forward-looking, hopeful glimpse, like sort of end on a note of positivity and that the audience can make a difference. And I think, a piece comes to mind for me. It's a podcast that's been around for a long time called The Intersection. It's a radio station out of San Francisco that does it. And they did an incredible series one season. What they do is they pick a different intersection, physical intersection like streets, every season, and they unpack sort of all the layers that affect that intersection. So they look at crime stats, they look at businesses, they look at who's walking by. And the one that I heard that really impressed me was looked at the Tenderloin District, which is the San Francisco equivalent of Vancouver's downtown east side. So it's a challenged area where there's lots of, addiction and things like that in evidence, but it's also a community. And so that piece, the reporter for that piece stood on the street corner for many days in a row, getting to know people, chatting them up. He also talked to all of the support workers and businesses around there that kind of serviced that community. So he got kind of like the big picture from them of like what are the policies we're dealing with that are affecting our ability to hand out food at this level, or this kind of thing. But then he went and spoke to people and explained what he was doing, and he did things like that whole series started out with an incredible scene of like these street involved unhoused folks, very industrious, setting up a barbecue on the sidewalk to feed their friends. And it was like incredible. Like, I thought that was a great storytelling, so that you learn to care about these people as a Louisiana inspired barbecue chef. Then you find out that this person has an addiction problem and can't see their kids. But you first find out who they are, and you first see some of the light in their personality, and you start to see them as a whole human being rather than just sort of a personified problem. Yeah, definitely the human first. Yeah.
Right, which we're starting to say, like in the frameworks that I build in systems and organizations, that we're actually not trying to arrive to this trauma-informed state. We're trying to arrive to a human first, that we care about humans more than the task, right? And that's what I hear you saying from even this journalistic and storytelling lens.
It makes sense from a storytelling lens, just pragmatically, because what it does is it makes that person more relatable to the audience. So then their level of engagement is higher. Whereas if you do the sort of shock and awe, that actually has a distancing effect, right?
Yeah. And I think this humanizing piece is like, wait, when I hear this, because we've all had a barbecue with friends, or right, this cookout with people we care about, where that ability to relate, because I think the hardest piece for people to sometimes wrap their minds around in the trauma-informed space is, how can I connect to you? How are you similar to me versus how are you dissimilar to me? And it feels like in our modern world where we're living in this, let me point out all the dissimilarities between us, versus humans got a lot of things we have in common that we can relate to each other. But again, kind of coming back to that, the connecting piece, the let's be in relationship before we get to all these things we got to work on as part of our relationship.
Yeah, and there's great examples of podcast hosts, for example, that will deliver a cake that they bake themselves to their guests. So they're not paying them per se, but they're showing up at their doorstep with a cake. Hi, thank you for letting me interview you. I baked you this cake. Like offering something in return. It can be a gesture. It doesn't have, like for our company, what we do is when we interview somebody, if they don't have a microphone, we ship them one and they keep it. And that's part of, we've worked that into the cost of doing business. And it actually is, I mean, shipping stuff back is ridiculous and adds, like, doubles the expense. So why wouldn't you just leave it with the person? And then they get something out of the thing that allows them to, carry on, maybe do more interviews. Like, it's a bit of a leg up for some people into this digital world. And it's our way of giving back a little bit and saying thank you.
I love that. I love that about you. See, it makes me love your company more and more as we're talking about it.
To be clear, our clients pay for that. So we roll that into our costs. Yeah, but that approach is our approach, and we've found it to be helpful. Yeah.
I love that. So as you kind of look forward, Jennifer, what do you see as trauma-informed techniques evolving in the media industry in general, especially with the rise, you just said, of digital and interactive storytelling? New technologies, new methodologies. Are you excited to explore? Are you worried about what's happening? Where are you sitting?
I think AI is a very interesting development. So there's a lot of people, like, you can go to a company like 11.io, 11 Labs, and you can pull down various types of people, like off a shelf, and you can insert their voices into your piece. And so I think the potential to perpetuate stereotypes there is very high, and it concerns me. So the lack of authenticity, too, also concerns me. So we've seen with the American election, we've seen people, posing as various politicians through AI voicing, and it's quite convincing. And I can see that being done. Like, if and when that is done to, like, a marginalized person, or just any person where you're not understanding the full context, where it's like an outside group basically creating a character through an AI to kind of mimic what they think that person might say, but in that voice, I think that's very disturbing. And because you're taking it out of context.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, right? We're in the heat of, I don't know exactly what date this will air, but we're in the heat of um political campaigning in the United States right now, and commercials galore. And there are two commercials in particular that I've been trying to research about. It doesn't seem like the person's mouth is matching up to what they're saying, and is this AI generated?
Yeah. I mean, it's wild. I have seen on the other side of the coin with the AI conversation, I have seen some interesting initiatives from like there's a nonprofit group that was started by I can't recall the name, but it was started by the mother of a school shooting victim in the States. And what she did is she used AI to program her son's voice, lobbying the government to stop, to fix the gun laws. And as a Canadian, this is something I feel very strongly about. I just think it's a mess down there. I don't know how y'all are dealing with that. And so this was an interesting use of AI, really provocative, stepped on a lot of toes, but it was the mom. I mean, it was her right to do that. Like if she wanted to take her son's voice to the wall for that reason, she had every right to do that, in my view. Her deceased son. I mean, come on, you know. So that's the thing, is like AI is a technology, just like a knife is a technology. If you give a knife to a toddler, it's a dangerous situation, but if you use it to cut a birthday cake, it's fine. And I think AI is sort of like that, but it's also it's questionable. It's built on like the corpus of the AI, right, which is like what it is made from, like the information that it has been fed. A lot of that is done in a sort of can be biased.
Well, because implicit bias, right? So not to get us down too much, but implicit bias is inherent to all of us, and humans made algorithms, and algorithms thus have implicit bias, and right? And so that's going to be baked into all of technology.
It's pretty hard to find ethically sourced AI is difficult to use on a wide scale. Like there's a lot of work being done to explore that. There's interesting experimentation going on at every university across the world right now around this. But in terms of a technology that you can work with in the everyday media landscape, ethically sourced AI is difficult to come by. You can ethically control how you use it, but the content that you're getting from it may have been borrowed without permission and is at the very least taken out of context. So you're looking at an amalgamation of what, an AI thinks is the truth.
I feel like we could have a whole conversation on this.
Oh yeah, I could go down that rabbit hole for a long time. So,
because like my brain just started, like you could see my pause of like, okay, no, I'm going to bring this back. So I'm super excited to ask you our quickfire questions, because I've written already several podcast musicians that I want to go check out based on what you said. And we will have links to all of those in our show notes. But before we get to quickfire, what advice would you give to storytellers out there who aspire to use their work to foster understanding and healing? What's a piece? Because I just know so many of our listeners have amazing stories that need to be heard, because many of them share them with me, and I'm trying to encourage the best I can. But what advice could you give?
well, first of all, I mean, I would offer congratulations for being at a place where you're considering sharing your story. And I would just encourage you to get really curious with yourself about why and what you hope to achieve by sharing your story, who you hope to impact by sharing your story, and then try to ensure that when you get someone that wants to listen to your story, or maybe you're sharing it yourself through your own podcast, figure out how you're going to reach out to that particular audience and take care of them. Like, what are you going to leave them with? I think hope is really important part of the equation. And so not forgetting that even if you're talking about hard things, that hope is something people need. And if you've come through the fire and you're here to tell the tale, then you're a walking testament to hope, right? So you can offer that.
I resonate so much. I was just thinking, gosh, our good friend John Lewis, who of course was longtime senator here in the States and civil rights activist, who said good trouble. That was kind of what was dingling around in my head, Jennifer, as I was hearing you on that hope piece, is that good trouble, that balance between truth and hope, the balance between saying the hard thing, speaking our truth, but keeping ourselves and others safe while we do it, right? That good trouble, that maybe stepping on toes.
Maybe stepping on a few toes, if there's a greater good involved, sure.
And, expecting that to be. Jennifer, it's been a pleasure having you on. I'm so excited to learn more from you about you and all the work that you're doing. But quickfire with our listeners have been super impactful. And so we want to know, what's the latest book or television show media that you're consuming, and why is it standing out for you?
Oh, I'm reading a book by a friend of mine called Steve Pratt that is called Earn It, and it's all about how to engage people in this kind of attention economy by having fun and trying stuff. So as opposed to having like an overly perfectionistic attitude as to the outcome of your endeavors, how can you sort of use popsicle sticks and glue and get out there and try stuff and put yourself out there? And it's called Earn It. Really good.
Love it. I love it. Sort of what we used to refer to as guerrilla marketing, right? Like we used to call it those
What can you then do with that? And it's really about attention, using the various media that we have access to garner attention, and then doing something with that attention once you have it.
I love it. This question has become a favorite of mine, which is historical or contemporary figure or leader that you would have dinner with. But what is the one question you would want to ask them?
I'm going to go Frida Kahlo. And I'm going to go, what was it like being underestimated as, Diego's wife your whole life, when you were clearly like such a force of nature? If you could look back, and Frida, if you could look back and give your younger self some advice, what would it be?
I so love this question, and it resonates with me because, listen, I'm in Michigan as we're recording this, Jennifer, and the Detroit Museum of Art, the DIA Institute of Art, has a gigantic Diego piece that is well known throughout the world. And every time I'm there, I try to ask somebody a question about Frida, and I get kind of this questioning look all the time. And so I just think that's such a great question. I love it. This idea of being underestimated.
His murals are pretty cool, and I mean, I've seen them, and there's a mural theme to this conversation today. So I do really like murals. They really speak to me, and so I do like his work. But I just love her work, and it's as distinct, if not more distinct, than his own. And I just think at different times she was kind of in his shadow.
And of course, his work, his piece is representative of industrialism, right? And it's in the DIA because it's right in Detroit, in the heart of Motor City, and kind of that whole industrial piece. And so it speaks to the community as well that it's in. But if you ask them about Frida, you get mixed responses depending on who's working that day.
I just love her the way she made the personal so magical. The way she made her pain, talking about trauma informed. I mean, that woman lived through so much pain, physical pain from the bus accident that she was in as a child, and how she turned that into these creative offerings is just like so incredibly inspiring.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So we want to know what hobby or activity is filling you with joy, that thing that just, you're so excited. I love asking this question because I can always see my guests' eyes light up just by asking it. We want you to be able to talk about the thing that just gives you unadulterated joy.
Oh, wow. Well, I do love audio storytelling. I really do. Like, I love a good audio story, like when it's told well and it takes you on a journey, like that theater of the mind. Like it's very satisfying for me, that kind of immersion. So I do enjoy creating things like that. But also, I'm from the Pacific Northwest, here in Vancouver, BC. And so one of the beautiful things about living here is we're in a rainforest. So I just love being able to step out into my local forest and take my dog on a little hike and like breathe some serious deep oxygen breaths. And, I find that really restorative. And I think that's the key to my ability to do all the other plate spinning that I do.
I love it because you have to refill yourself, right? Part of this trauma informed work, whether it's storytelling, whether it's trauma informed management, whatever your venue of work is, that idea that you have to refill your bucket, that you can only give what you're overflowing to, seems for me to be a building theme of having these conversations with folks. And it's why I asked the question, because without that, you can't be trauma informed.
Yeah, you do. You do. Yeah, you have to fill your bucket. Absolutely. You have to. Yeah.
I love that. Jennifer, it's been a pleasure having you on. Where can our guests learn more about you, more about Jar Audio, and all the fabulous things that you're working on?
Yeah, well, it's pretty simple. I would probably just direct them to jaraudio.com. And it talks about all the people that work there and some of the projects that we've worked on. And then the other place you could check out would be the UBC Creative Writing Department's website. If that is something that interests you, it's a great program. It's a great department, very trauma-informed approach to teaching writing. And so it might be something that might interest some of your listeners.
We love that because we know many of our listeners want to write books. They want to talk about these stories in depth. So please reach out to Jennifer and her team there at Jar Audio or at UBC, which is a great institution, by the way. Because I don't know why. Someday in my life, I must live in British Columbia, but I love Vancouver. I don't know. I feel called to that. I always feel called to that area, Jennifer.
It's beautiful up here, and we'll go for tea if you come up, so let me know.
I will keep you informed. Jennifer, great to have you on our show today. For all of our listeners who are out there listening, we're so glad that you tune in. We're glad to have you with us, to be part of our community. You are important to us. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please show your support by liking, commenting, or following us, reviewing the episode on your favorite podcast platform. It does matter. That is the part of the work that we have to talk about. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and brings even better content your way. We will have links in our show notes for all the great resources that Jennifer gave us today. But if you need more, please head over to chefaloconsulting.com. And we'd love to hear from you. Drop us a comment on Spotify or YouTube. Share what topics you'd like us to cover or who you'd like to see as our next guest. Maybe it's you. We'd love to have you on. Your voice matters. Your perspective matters. And your story is important to us. Thanks for listening. And remember, we can do hard things. And maybe the theme of our topic with Jennifer today, it's okay to step on a few toes. We can get in good trouble together. Thanks, everyone, for listening. It's been a joy having you. Thank you again, Jennifer. We love having you as part of our community.
Thanks.
Mindful Management, Creating a Trauma-Informed Work Environment is brought to you by Chefalo Consulting. To learn more about Chefalo Consulting and our trauma-informed change management and professional development solutions, please visit chefaloconsulting.com. That's Chefalo, CHEFALO, consulting.com. Make sure you don't miss these transformative conversations by subscribing to Mindful Management wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for listening. And remember, change happens one step at a time.